I saw her step off the noon stage on a Tuesday in September, and my hands went still on the halter. I was threading like the blood had quit moving in them. 8 years. 8 years since Lenora Cade had left Coulter Springs with a carpetbag and a letter from a man in Philadelphia folded inside her Bible, and I'd told myself every single morning since that I was over it. I'd said it so many times it should have been true by now. A man repeats a thing often enough, it hardens into fact, the way a creek bed hardens in a drought. Except the creek bed remembers the water. Every groove in it is a record of what used to flow there. She stepped down from the stage and put her hand on the iron rail, and the dust from the road settled on the hem of her traveling dress, and I stood across the street by the livery with a halter in one hand and a lie in my chest, and 8 years of fence mending behind me. The stage driver handed down a single trunk. That was the first thing I noticed. She'd left with a carpetbag and a future. She came back with one trunk and the particular stillness of a woman who had buried something. I knew what it was before anyone told me. You don't carry that kind of quiet unless it costs you. I turned back to the livery and finished threading the halter, and I did not walk across the street, and I did not say her name, and when Harlan Pace at the feed store told me that afternoon that Jasper Cade's daughter had come home a widow, I nodded like I was hearing the weather report and bought my grain and left. Coulter Springs was not a large town. It sat in a crease of the Flint Ridge Hills where two creeks met, and everything in it, the mercantile, the livery, the church, the schoolhouse she'd once taught in, could be walked end to end in 6 minutes. A man could not avoid a woman in a town that size. Not for long. Not if he was honest about the mathematics of it. But I was not honest about a great many things that September, and I intended to go on being dishonest about them until one of us was dead or relocated. That lasted 4 days. On the 4th day, I rode in for a replacement cinch ring, and she was standing on the porch of her father's house. The house I had painted 2 springs ago when the clapboard started to peel, the house whose well I had relined in the winter of the 3rd year. The house whose cedar fence I had mended and reset every spring and fall like a man attending a grave, and she was looking at the fence. She was looking at the fence the way you look at a letter you didn't expect. I kept riding. My horse knew the way to the livery. I didn't need to steer him, which was useful because my hands had stopped working again. I bought the cinch ring. I rode home. I mended a line of wire on the south pasture that didn't need mending. I cooked supper and ate half of it and fed the rest to the dog and sat on my porch in the dark and listened to the coyotes and told myself I was a man who was over it. The next morning I rode the fence line on the east side of my property, the side that bordered what had been Jasper Cade's 40 acres. The grass was tall along the boundary. I could see the roof of the Cade house from the rise, and a thread of smoke from the chimney. She'd lit the stove. Something in my chest moved that I'd spent 8 years mortaring shut, and I turned the horse and rode the other direction, and spent the day digging post holes I didn't need. It was Thea Lawrence who undid me. Thea ran the mercantile with her husband Boyd, and she had a talent for inserting herself into the machinery of other people's lives, with the gentle precision of a woman who believed the Lord had put her on earth to manage things. "Emmett Boone," she said when I came in for lamp oil the following week, "Lenora Cade has been back 6 days, and you haven't so much as brought her a jar of preserves." "I don't make preserves." "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean. I don't agree with it." Thea wiped the counter with a rag that didn't need wiping. She's alone in that house. Her father's been gone 9 years. The place has held up remarkably well, considering. Someone's been looking after it, I'd wager. But a woman alone on a 40-acre claim with winter coming needs neighbors. She has neighbors. The Patchetts are a quarter-mile east. The Patchetts are 70 years old. Then they're experienced. Thea fixed me with the look she reserved for men who were being deliberately stupid, which in her experience was most men most of the time. "Emmett, whatever happened between you two?" Nothing happened between us. Exactly, Thea said. That's the problem, isn't it? I bought my lamp oil and left without answering, because Thea Lawrence had a way of cutting straight through to the thing you'd spent years burying, and I didn't care to stand there and bleed in the mercantile. But she was right. Nothing had happened between Lenora Cade and me. That was the whole of it. We had been young. I was 26 and she was 22, and her father had just died, and the schoolhouse had closed for the winter, and she was alone on that 40 acres with no family left and a grief she carried like a stone in her coat pocket. I'd ridden over to mend a fence section that had come down in a storm, and I'd stayed to fix the porch step, and I'd come back the next day to check on her, and the day after that, and the one after that, until I was riding over every evening and sitting on that porch and talking to her in the dark about nothing important. The weather, the stock prices in Cheyenne, the coyotes, while something that was not nothing built itself between us one quiet hour at a time. I never said it. Whatever it was, I never put words around it. I was a rancher's son with dirt under my nails and 160 acres of unfenced grassland and a vocabulary for livestock and weather. And I did not have the language for what I felt when Lenora Cade looked at me across that porch rail with her father's death still fresh in her eyes and the lamplight in her hair. Then the letter came from Philadelphia, a man she'd known through correspondence, a teacher, an educated man, a man who could talk about books and music and the world east of the Missouri, had written to ask if she would come. Not a proposal, not yet. An invitation. Come see what the world looks like from the other side. She told me about it on the porch on a Wednesday evening in October. She held the letter in both hands and she said, "He's asked me to visit." And I said, "That's a long way to go for a visit." And she said, "I know." And I should have said the rest. I should have said, "Don't go, stay here. I'll build you whatever you need." I should have said, "I'm not an educated man and I don't know anything about music, but I know how to keep a place standing and I know how to keep you warm and I know that what's between us on this porch is not nothing, and if you give me time, I will learn the words for it." But I was 26 and I had dirt under my nails, and I did not say any of it. She left on a Friday morning in November. I drove her to the stage in my wagon. I carried her carpet bag and set it on the step, and she looked at me with her hand on the rail and her eyes full of something I couldn't read, or wouldn't, and she said, "I'll write." She wrote 3 letters. I have them in a box in my bureau. Dry ink on dry paper, 8 years old. She told me about Philadelphia, about the buildings and the crowds and the gaslit streets. She told me the man, she called him Thomas, had taken her to a concert hall. She told me she missed the quiet. I wrote back once. I am not proud of what I said in that letter. It was short and it was careful, and it was the kind of letter a man writes when he is trying to say nothing and hopes the woman will hear everything. And she didn't, because how could she? You cannot hear what a man won't say. Her 4th letter never came. I waited through December and January and February, and then I stopped checking at the post office. And then Thea Lawrence told me in March that she'd heard Lenora Cade had married the teacher in Philadelphia. I went home and dug post holes until my hands bled and the south pasture had more fence than it would ever need. And after that, I did not speak about Lenora Cade again to anyone, and nobody in Coulter Springs was unwise enough to bring her up. But I kept her father's place. I don't know when it started exactly. A few months after she left, the porch step I'd fixed came loose again, and I rode over and fixed it. Then a section of cedar fence went down in a spring storm, and I reset it. Then I noticed the well cover was cracked and I replaced it. Then the clapboard started to peel and I scraped it and painted it. Then the chimney mortar crumbled and I repointed it. Year by year, season by season, I maintained the Cade property like a man tending a church he no longer attended but couldn't bring himself to let fall. Nobody asked me about it. The property sat between my east fence line and the Patchett place, and old Abel Patchett saw me working there more than once and never said a word, because Abel Patchett was a man who understood the things a man does when he will not say the thing he means. I mended that fence every spring and every fall. I kept the gate oiled. I cleared the path from the road. I replaced 3 shingles and a window frame and the iron latch on the barn door. I did not, in any of those 8 years, set foot inside the house. The house was hers. The rest I could justify as neighborliness, as property maintenance, as the reasonable acts of a man who didn't want a derelict claim attracting squatters next to his own line. The house I could not justify. So I mended the outside and left the inside and rode home and told myself I was a man who was over it. And the lie got smoother every year the way a worn saddle gets smoother. And it fit me just as well. And it was just as much a thing shaped by long use rather than truth. Now she was back, and she was a widow, and she was standing on that porch looking at my fence, her fence. The fence I had mended 16 times in her absence. And the mathematics I'd been avoiding for 8 years had walked back into Coulter Springs on the noon stage with one trunk and the quiet that comes from burying someone. I held out for another week. Then the wind shifted and the temperature dropped and I knew what was coming, and whatever else was true about me and Lenora Cade, I was not the kind of man who let a woman go into a mountain winter with an empty woodshed. I loaded my wagon with a cord of split pine and drove it to the Cade property on a Saturday morning. The sky was the color of old tin. She was in the yard hanging laundry, and the wind was pulling at the sheets, and she turned when she heard the wagon and went still. "Emmett," she said. "Lenora." I hadn't said her name in 8 years. It tasted like something I'd forgotten I knew. "I brought wood," I said, which was obvious, and I climbed down from the wagon and started unloading it into the woodshed without waiting for her to answer. Because if I waited for her to answer, I would have to look at her, and if I looked at her, I did not trust what my face would do. She came and stood near the woodshed door. "You don't have to do that. Wood's already cut, no sense hauling it back." "You cut it for me." "I cut it for the property. Woodshed shouldn't sit empty going into October." There was a silence. The kind of silence that has weight. "Someone's been looking after this place," she said. "The fence, the porch, the well." I stacked the last of the pine and straightened. Neighbor's responsibility. "For 8 years. I'm a responsible neighbor." She looked at me then, and I made the mistake of looking back, and her eyes were the same color they'd been on that porch in October 8 years ago. A deep brown with flecks of something warmer, like creek water catching the last light. And whatever I'd spent 8 years mortaring shut cracked straight down the middle, and the water that had carved those grooves came rushing back. I looked away. "I'll bring another cord next week." "Emmett." "The chimney mortar's holding, but you should check the damper." I repointed it 2 winters back, but the draw might be off. If it smokes, let the flue cool and clear the baffle. "Emmett." "The well's clean. I relined it in '78. The rope's sound, but the bucket handle's starting to work loose." "Emmett, will you stop telling me about the well and look at me?" I looked at her. She was thinner than I remembered, and her hair was pulled back under a calico bonnet, and her hands were red from the laundry, and she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I hated myself for still thinking it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, for 8 years of it." I picked up the wagon gate and slotted it back into place. "Don't need to thank me. It's a property matter." "It's not a property matter, and we both know it." I climbed back onto the wagon seat. "I'll bring the other cord Tuesday." I drove home without looking back, and the coyotes that night sounded like they were laughing, and I suppose they had reason. The second cord of wood led to a conversation about the barn door, which led to an afternoon replacing the hinge, which led to her bringing me water and us standing in the yard while the light went amber, and neither of us saying the thing we were standing around. I came back 2 days later to check the roof flashing. She offered coffee. I declined. She offered it again. I accepted because I could not decline coffee from a woman twice without being the kind of man I did not want to be. We sat on the porch. Her father's porch. The porch where we'd sat in the dark 8 autumns ago and talked about nothing while something that was not nothing took root. She held her cup in both hands the way she always had, and she said, "The town looks the same. Towns don't change much out here. Some things do." I drank my coffee. Some things. Thea Lawrence says you never married. Thea Lawrence says a great deal. She says you haven't courted a woman in 8 years. Thea Lawrence needs a wider field of interest. Lenora smiled, and the smile broke something open in her face that the widow's quiet had been holding shut, and for a moment she looked 22 again, standing on this same porch with a letter in her hands and a choice to make. "I should tell you about Thomas," she said. "You don't owe me that." "I know I don't owe it. I want to tell you." I set my cup on the rail. "All right." She told me. She told me about Philadelphia, the noise, the smoke, the crowds that pressed in on all sides until you couldn't find the horizon. She told me Thomas was kind and earnest and loved her as well as he knew how. She told me they married in the spring and she taught at a school for girls and they lived in 2 rooms above a stationer's shop and he read to her in the evenings. She told me he coughed through their first winter and bled through their second and was gone by the 3rd spring, 31 years old, buried in a churchyard she couldn't see the mountains from. "I stayed another year," she said. "I don't know why, stubbornness maybe, pride. I didn't want to come home, as the woman who'd left and failed." "You didn't fail." "I chose something that didn't last. Some people would call that failing. Some people are wrong about a great many things." She looked at me, and whatever she saw in my face made her set her cup down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't steady. "Why did you keep the fence?" she said. "I told you, property matter. And the porch, and the well, and the chimney, and the clapboard, and the woodshed full of pine before I even asked. That's not a property matter, Emmett. That's a man waiting for someone to come home." I stood up. "I should check that roof flashing before the light goes." "Emmett, the flashing won't hold if we get ice." I went around the side of the house and climbed the ladder I'd left leaning there, and I checked the flashing, which was fine because I'd redone it 18 months ago, and I stayed on the roof for 20 minutes longer than I needed to because a man can only be asked to tell the truth so many times in one afternoon before it comes out of him whether he wants it to or not. When I came down, she'd gone inside. The coffee cups were washed and set upside down on the porch rail to dry, and the door was closed, and I drove home with the taste of her coffee in my mouth, and the truth sitting in my chest like a coal that wouldn't go out no matter how much silence I banked on top of it. The temperature dropped that week. Not a freeze yet, but the warning of one, the air thin and sharp, the light coming in low and hard across the hills, the elk moving down from the high meadows. I spent 3 days laying in hay and grain and checking the stock shelters, and I did not go to the Cade property, and I did not think about Lenora Cade, and both of those are lies. On Thursday, old Abel Patchett rode over to my place. Abel was 73 and rode a mule named Josephus that was nearly as old as he was in disposition, and he sat on that mule in my yard and watched me mending a gate latch and said, "Cade girl's back. I'm aware. She was looking for you at the Mercantile this morning." "I wasn't at the Mercantile this morning." That's what Thea told her. Abel sat there for another minute, the mule standing with the patience of a creature that had outlasted most of the things it had opinions about. "A man can mend a fence for 8 years, Abel said, or he can tell the woman what the fence means. One of those uses less cedar." "Abel, I'm going. Josephus doesn't care for your yard." He turned the mule. "Don't waste another 8 years, Boone. You haven't got that many left." He rode off. The mule's ears rotated once in what I chose to interpret as agreement. On Saturday, I rode into town for kerosene, and Lenora was at the schoolhouse. Not teaching, the school had a teacher now, a young man named Wyatt from somewhere in Kansas, but standing outside, looking at the building the way she'd looked at the fence, reading something in the clapboard. She wore a dark dress, not morning black, but close, and her hair was down, and the wind pushed it across her face, and she brushed it back with one hand and saw me. "The schoolhouse got a new bell," she said. 3 years ago, the old one cracked. I liked the old one. It had a wobble in the ring. That's why it cracked. She smiled again, small this time. Everything changes. Some things don't change as much as you'd think. She looked at me and I looked at her, and the street was empty except for Boyd Lawrence sweeping his storefront, and the wind came down off the Flint Ridge and carried the smell of snow, and I said, "I'll bring another load of wood Monday." "You've brought enough wood." "Not for a mountain winter." "Emmett, you've brought enough wood for 3 mountain winters. The woodshed is full. There is wood stacked behind the woodshed. There is wood next to the barn." "Can't have too much." "You can if you're using it to avoid a conversation." I shifted in the saddle. My horse, a big dun gelding named Flint, because I am not a creative man stamped in blue steam. "Come for supper Monday," she said. "Instead of bringing wood, just come and sit at the table and eat a meal and talk to me like a person you've known your whole life, because that's what I am." "Lenora." "Monday, 6 o'clock, I'm making stew." She went inside the schoolhouse, and I sat on my horse in the empty street and knew with perfect clarity that I was going to be at that table Monday at 6 o'clock, no matter what I told myself between now and then. I arrived at 5:45 carrying a loaf of bread I'd baked that afternoon. I am not a good baker, and the loaf was denser than it should have been, with a crack down the center that looked like a fault line, and she took it from me and said, "You baked," and I said, "Don't get used to it," and she laughed. She laughed. I hadn't heard that sound in 8 years, and it went through me like the first warm day after a long winter. The kind of day where the ice on the stock trough cracks and the water underneath is still moving, and you realize nothing froze all the way down. The house smelled like stew and wood smoke, and something else, cedar maybe, from the logs in the stove, and she'd set the table with 2 plates and 2 cups and a candle, and the candle threw light on the walls her father had papered 20 years ago, and the paper was faded but it was holding. And I thought about how a thing can fade without falling apart if someone keeps the structure around it sound. We ate. The stew was good, venison and wild onion and potatoes, the kind of meal that fills a man up and settles him. We talked about the town, who'd married, who'd left, who'd died. Old Jonah's Prentice, who'd run the livery, gone in the winter of '80. His son Carl running it now badly. The Widener family, 4 brothers who'd homesteaded east of the Patchetts and built a decent cattle operation out of nothing. The church roof that leaked every spring until Boyd Lawrence organized a crew to reshingle it. She listened the way she'd always listened, leaning forward slightly, her chin on her hand, her eyes steady. Like what you were saying mattered even when it didn't. "You've built the ranch up," she said. "Thea tells me you're running 400 head. 380, Thea rounds up. That's a lot of land for one man. I've got 2 hands, Dawson Kemp and his boy. They come on in the spring. And the rest of the year. The rest of the year it's me." She was quiet for a moment. "It must be lonely." "I stay busy." "That's not the same thing." "No," I said, and the word came out before I could catch it, bare and honest and more than I'd intended. "No, it's not." The candle flickered. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, and I heard the cedar fence creak, my fence, the one I'd mended 16 times, and the sound was as familiar to me as the creak of my own front door. "Tell me something," she said. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone." I don't have much practice at that. I know, that's why I'm asking. I turned the coffee cup in my hands. It was her father's cup, blue enamel, chipped on the rim, and I'd drunk from it 100 times on that porch 8 years ago. I was going to tell you, I said, that last night on the porch before you showed me the letter. She went very still. I'd ridden over with the words in my head the whole ride. I'd practiced them, which is not something I do well. I was going to say, I set the cup down. I was going to ask you to stay, not just to stay with me, to let me build the life around you that I could see in my head every time I closed my eyes. What stopped you? You had the letter in your hands, and you were smiling. Not the kind of smile a man interrupts. Emmett, I saw your face, and you looked like a woman who'd been offered the world. And I had 160 acres and a barn that needed roofing, and nothing to offer you that compared to a concert hall and a man who could talk about books. You think that's what I wanted, books and concert halls? I thought that's what you deserved. The wind pushed the door and the latch caught, and the house held. The house I'd kept for her. The house I'd painted and patched and reshingled and never set foot inside, because the inside was hers and I had no claim on it. I wrote you a 4th letter, she said. I looked up. I wrote it 6 months after I married Thomas. I sat at the window of our rooms above the stationer's shop, and I looked out at a street full of people I didn't know, and I wrote you a letter that said everything I should have said on that porch. I never got it. I know I didn't send it. Why? Because I'd made a choice, and Thomas was kind and he loved me, and sending that letter would have been a cruelty to him and a false hope to you, and I couldn't do either of those things. What did it say? She stood and went to her trunk, the single trunk she'd come home with, and opened it and took out an envelope. It was yellowed and soft, the way paper gets when it's been handled many times, and she held it the way she'd held that first letter from Philadelphia in both hands, like a thing with weight. It said that I was sitting in a room full of books in the most educated city in the country, married to the kindest man I'd ever met, and all I could think about was the sound of your boots on my father's porch. I didn't move. It said that Thomas was everything a woman should want, and I loved him, and I would stay with him and be a good wife to him. And none of that changed the fact that, when I closed my eyes at night, the place I went to was your ranch, and the face I saw was yours. Lenora. It said that I'd made the wrong choice, and I knew it, and I would live with it because that's what a person does. You make a choice and you stand in it, even when it's wrong, because the alternative is burning down 2 lives instead of 1. She set the letter on the table between us. I didn't send it because I believed what I just said. You make a choice and you stand in it. But now Thomas is gone, and the choice is made differently, and I'm sitting in my father's house that you kept standing for 8 years, and I'm telling you what the letter said, because I'm not 22 anymore, and I don't have time to waste on the things I should have told you. The candle had burned down to a stub. The shadows in the house were long. I could hear the wind in the cedar trees outside and the faint groan of the fence posts, and the fire in the stove popped once and settled. I reached across the table and picked up the letter. I turned it in my hands. It was addressed to me in her handwriting, my name, my ranch, Coulter Springs, and the ink had faded but the letters were steady. She'd written it with a sure hand. You kept it, I said. I kept it. 5 years. 5 years and 4 months. I put the letter down. I looked at her. I mended your fence every spring and every fall, I said. I reset the posts and tightened the wire and oiled the gate and replaced 3 pickets and a cross rail. I painted your house. I repointed your chimney. I relined your well. I replaced a window frame and 3 shingles and the barn door latch. I filled your woodshed. I cleared your path. She didn't say anything. Her eyes were bright in the candlelight. I did all of it, and I told myself it was a property matter. and I told Abel Patchett it was a neighbor's responsibility. And I told Thea Lawrence nothing at all because Thea Lawrence already knew what it was, and I couldn't say it out loud because if I said it out loud it would become real. And if it became real, I would have to do something about it. And the thing I would have to do was admit that I was keeping your father's place for the same reason you kept that letter. And what reason is that? Because I wasn't over it. Not one single day. Not 1 hour. I wasn't over it when you left, and I wasn't over it when you married, and I wasn't over it when I rode past this house every week for 8 years with a fencing tool in my hand and your name in my throat. The fence was the only way I knew to say it. I'm not a man with words, Lenora. I'm a man with cedar posts and a hammer. She stood up. She came around the table. She put her hands on mine. Her hands were rough from laundry and cold, and mine were rough from everything, and she held them and she said, "You said it fine." I did not kiss her that night. That is not what happened. What happened was smaller and I think more honest. She held my hands across the table in her father's kitchen, and I let her, and the fire burned low, and the wind outside kept pushing at the house that held because I had spent 8 years making sure it would. And after a while she let go and poured more coffee, and we sat there in the quiet and drank it, and neither of us said anything else, because the things that needed saying had been said. I rode home in the dark. The stars were out, hard and bright the way they get before a freeze, and Flint picked his way along the trail without needing guidance, and the coyotes were quiet for once, and the world was very still, and the coal in my chest that wouldn't go out was burning with a different kind of heat, not the banked and smothered kind, but the kind that gives light. The freeze came Wednesday. I woke to ice on the stock trough and frost on the window panes, and the particular silence that means the world has locked down for a while. I spent the morning breaking ice and checking the shelters, and making sure the Hand's cabin on the south section was stocked for when Dawson and his boy came up in the spring. By afternoon the sky had gone flat and white, and the air tasted of iron, and I knew we were getting snow. I saddled Flint and rode to the Cade place. Not for the fence, not for the chimney or the well or the woodshed. I rode there because a woman alone on a 40-acre claim with a freeze coming should not be alone. She met me at the gate I'd oiled last spring, and she looked at the sky and said, "Snow. Before nightfall. I've got wood. I know I put it there." She almost smiled. "Come in." I stabled Flint in her barn, the barn whose door latch I'd replaced, and I checked her stock, which consisted of a milk cow and 4 chickens, all of them unimpressed by the cold. I split more kindling and stacked it inside the back door. I checked the window frames for drafts and found one on the north side and stuffed it with rags. The snow started at 4. Not a blizzard, a steady, quiet fall, the kind that means business. Within an hour the ground was covered, and by dark the fence posts wore 2 inches of white, and the world had gone to that muffled stillness where the only sounds are the fire and the house settling. We ate supper. Salt pork and beans and the last of a cornbread she'd made that morning. I washed the plates while she dried them, and we worked side by side at the basin without speaking, and the domesticity of it, the ordinariness, the simple rhythm of soapy water and a towel and 2 people doing a small task together, undid me more completely than anything she'd said. This was what I had wanted, not just her but this, the quiet architecture of a shared life, the evening fire, the table set for 2, the sound of another person breathing in the room. "You could stay," she said. "Until the snow stops, there's the spare room. I should get back to the stock. Emmett, your stock has shelters and hay, and they've survived every winter for 8 years without you standing over them through the night. Stay." I stayed, not because of the snow, because she'd asked, and I was done with the version of myself who would have ridden home to prove he didn't need what he needed. I slept in the spare room, Jasper Cade's old room, with the iron bed frame and the quilt she'd hung to air, and I listened to the snow ticking against the window and the fire settling in the stove and the house holding, and I slept better than I had in a long time. In the morning the world was white and still, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up into a sky that had cleared to the color of lake ice. She was already up when I came out, and the coffee was made, and she poured a cup and set it at my place, as if I had one, as if the table had already decided where I belonged, and we drank our coffee and watched the light come up through the frost on the window panes. "I want to teach again," she said. "Young Wyatt's leaving in the spring, he told Boyd Lawrence last week. The school will need someone." "You were a good teacher." "I was all right. The Patchett grandchildren couldn't spell when I left." "The Patchett grandchildren can't spell now. That's a genetic matter." She laughed the second time. Each one was a small demolition of something I'd spent 8 years building. "I'd need to fix this place up properly," she said. "Not just maintained, lived in. The inside needs work. Wallpaper, the floors, the kitchen shelves. My father's things are still in the attic." "I can help with that." "I know you can. That's not really what I'm asking." I set my cup down. "What are you asking?" She looked at me. The morning light was on her face, and the frost on the window made patterns like fern leaves, and the house was warm and the coffee was good, and the woman I had loved since I was 26 was sitting 3 feet from me asking me a question I could either answer or run from. "I'm asking if you're going to keep mending the fence from the outside," she said, "or if you're ready to come through the gate." I looked at my hands. They were weathered and scarred and stained with pine sap from all the wood I'd split and fence posts I'd set, and houses I'd painted while pretending I wasn't waiting for exactly this. And I thought about 8 years, and the letter she didn't send, and the words I didn't say, and the evening on the porch when I should have spoken, and the morning on the stage step when I should have asked her to stay, and every mended fence post that was nothing more than a man's heart hammered into cedar because he didn't know how to say it any other way. "I'm ready," I said. 2 words after 8 years, 2 words. She reached across the table and took my hand, and her grip was strong, the grip of a woman who had carried a carpetbag and a grief and a wrong choice across a continent and back again, and was done letting go of the things that mattered. "Good," she said. "Then stay for breakfast, and after breakfast we'll clear the snow off the porch, and after that you can start on the kitchen shelves." I stayed for breakfast, and after breakfast we cleared the porch, and after that I measured the kitchen for shelves, and she held the other end of the string, and we worked together the way we should have worked together 8 years ago, and the house that I'd kept standing from the outside began to become a house kept standing from the inside. That was the beginning. I should tell you how it went, because the beginning is not the hard part. The beginning is the crack in the dam. The hard part is everything that flows through it. We did not rush. I think we had both learned what rushing costs. She'd rushed to Philadelphia and a kind man's offer, and I'd rushed to silence when I should have spoken, and neither of us was willing to make the same mistake twice. So the days passed, and I came to the Cade place most mornings, and we worked on the house, and in the evenings we sat on the porch when it was warm enough or by the fire when it wasn't, and we talked. We talked the way 2 people talk who have known each other a long time and have a great deal to catch up on, not the big things, which we'd already said, but the small ones. The daily accumulations. She told me about her students in Philadelphia, the girls who'd been hungry for learning the way calves are hungry for grass, with their whole bodies leaning toward it. I told her about the calf I'd pulled in the blizzard of '79, the one that came out sideways and lived anyway and grew into the stubbornest bull in 3 counties. She told me about the concert hall and the music, and how it had filled a room so completely that for a moment she'd forgotten where she was. I told her about the night I'd ridden the ridge line in a thunderstorm looking for a lost horse, and the lightning had lit the valley below like noon, and I'd seen every blade of grass and every shadow, and for a moment the world had been so clear that I'd forgotten I was alone. She told me about Thomas, not the dying, she'd said enough about that, but the living, how he'd read to her in the evenings, how he'd saved the ends of bread for the birds on the windowsill, how he'd been a good man who deserved better than a wife whose heart was in another territory. She told me this without guilt, not because she didn't feel it, but because she'd already paid it and there was no sense in counting the coins twice. I listened. I did not tell her it was all right, because it wasn't mine to forgive. I did not tell her Thomas was a lucky man, because I wasn't sure that was true. I told her that a man who reads to his wife in the evenings is a man worth remembering, and she looked at me with her eyes full and said, "He was." The shelves got built. The wallpaper in the front room got stripped and replaced. Her father's things came down from the attic: an old rifle, a tintype of her mother, a box of letters, a pocket knife with a bone handle, and she set them on the new shelf in the front room, and the house began to look lived in again instead of merely maintained. December came. The schoolhouse closed for the winter. The young teacher, Wyatt, confirmed he was leaving in the spring. His mother was sick in Kansas and he was going back. The school board, Boyd Lawrence, Abel Patchett, and Margaret Cope from the ranch south of town, asked Lenora if she'd take the position. She said yes. I was there when she said it, standing in the back of the church where the board met, and she stood at the front and said she would be honored to teach again, and her voice was steady and her back was straight, and she was every inch the woman I'd watched walk away 8 years ago, except now she was walking towards something instead of away from it. That night I drove her home and walked her to the door, and she turned on the porch step, the step I'd fixed twice, and looked at me. "You could stop going home," she said. "Lenora." "Not like that. I'm asking you to think about what it would look like if you stayed. If your boots were on this porch every morning instead of just most mornings. If the place across the table was yours in the way it already is, but neither of us has named. I've thought about it. And I've been thinking about it for 8 years. Thinking isn't the problem. Then what is?" I took my hat off. The air was cold and the stars were out and her face was lit by the lantern in the window and I could smell wood smoke and snow. "I don't want to be the thing you settled for," I said. "I don't want to be the man who was here when you came back because I was always here. I want, if you're going to choose me, I want it to be a choice. Not geography, not convenience. Not because the woodshed is full and the fence is mended and I'm the man who stuck around." She came down one step. She was close enough that I could see the frost on her eyelashes. "Emmett Boone. I had a husband who read to me in the evenings and took me to concerts and lived in a city full of every opportunity a woman could ask for. And I loved him. And he was good to me. And every night I fell asleep thinking about a ranch in the Flint Ridge Hills and a man who wouldn't say what he felt but said it anyway in every fence post and shingle and window frame he touched. I am not settling. I have never in my life settled. I came back to this town because this is where I belong, and you are who I belong with. And if you need me to say it plainer than that, then you're not the man I thought you were." I put my hat back on. Then I took it off again. Then I set it on the porch rail because I didn't know what to do with my hands when I wasn't holding a hammer or a fence post. "That's plain enough," I said. "Good. I'll come for breakfast." "You'll come for breakfast every morning for the rest of your life, Emmett Boone, or I'll mend that fence myself and I won't do as good a job as you." I drove home. I did not sleep, not from worry or regret, from the peculiar alertness of a man who has been given the thing he wanted and doesn't yet trust that it will be there in the morning. It was there in the morning. I sold the house on my ranch to Dawson Kemp that spring. Not the land. I kept the acreage and ran the cattle from the Cade place, which was closer to the good grass anyway. But the house, the one I'd built with my father when I was 19 and lived in alone for 8 years, while the woman I loved was in Philadelphia learning that a concert hall is no substitute for a porch. We married in March in the church with the new shingles. Abel Patchett stood as witness. Thea Lawrence cried, which was unlike her, and then organized the reception, which was like her. The Widener brothers brought a side of beef. Margaret Cope brought 3 pies. Young Wyatt, who was leaving the following week, played his fiddle, and the music was not what you'd hear in a Philadelphia concert hall, but it was what you'd hear in Coulter Springs, and that was good enough for both of us. I moved into the Cade house, our house now, and I built the kitchen shelves and replaced the back door and framed a window in the spare room that looked out toward the Flint Ridge. And she hung curtains that her mother had sewn 30 years ago, and the house filled up with the sounds and smells of 2 people living in it instead of 1 man maintaining it. She took over the schoolhouse in April. I dropped her off in the wagon the first morning, the Patchett grandchildren and the Widener children and the Cope girls waiting on the steps, and she climbed down and straightened her back and walked up those steps with the same steadiness she'd walked up the steps of the noon stage 8 years ago, except this time she was arriving instead of leaving. I watched from the wagon. The littlest Cope girl, Ruth, maybe 5, took Lenora's hand and said something I couldn't hear, and Lenora bent down and answered, and the child laughed, and the sound of it carried across the yard like the school bell used to carry, and I sat there on the wagon seat with the reins in my hands and the knowledge that I had finally, after 8 years of mended fences and unmailed letters and unmade confessions, come through the gate. The fence still stands. I mend it every spring and fall out of habit, and because cedar doesn't last forever and the wire loosens in the frost. But now when I mend it, I can see her through the kitchen window, grading papers or starting supper or hanging laundry, and sometimes she sees me and waves, and sometimes she doesn't, and it doesn't matter, because the fence is just a fence now. It is no longer the only way I know to say it.